Aycock from the University of Calgary, and I'd like to begin by explaining how this work came about. So back in 1984, a computer company called Osborne put out a machine called the Vixen. Now, I would be remiss in 2018 if I did not at least pause briefly to comment on this name. There are a few meanings of Vixen which don't have some amount of sexism involved. And in fact, if you look at the original advertising literature, it seemed to be squarely targeted at the businessman. But in context, I looked at more of their advertising literature, and their ads tend to be either text or, with the earlier machines, more balanced. So this was a name that was perhaps ill-advised in retrospect, but wasn't indicative of some larger marketing issue. But the machine itself had a Z80 CPU, a whopping 64 kilobytes of memory, 2 floppy disk drives, and the CP/M operating system, which you can think of as MS-DOS done correctly, and it was available for a variety of platforms. But the real selling feature of this computer was that it was portable, or in modern terms, you would think of this as a luggable computer. And half of an IBM Selectric puts it in at 10 kilograms. Now, this is approximately 15 iPad Pros, or about 1/600th of an African elephant. I wish I could tell you that we did this work and we're here today because of some deep intellectual curiosity about this machine or this game, but the reason we're really here today is because I have a problem. I collect entirely too many old computers and old game consoles, and I was minding my own business, innocently perusing some eBay listings one day, and I saw this listing for the Osborne Vixen, which I had not previously heard of. And in the pictures the seller had provided, they provided screenshots of all the bundled software. And in amongst those was an image of this game I had never heard of before called Desolation, which had a fairly unique visual aspect to it. Now, I went to the usual sources of truth and wisdom, which is to say Wikipedia, and it helpfully informed me that it was a game. I also discovered a game review, and I honestly don't know if they're being sarcastic or not. But even at this stage, I had some initial questions. So, was this some sort of graphics on the Vixen? Was it a custom font? There were levels. How was this information stored? And were there some interesting programming things going on? Now, to make this a bit challenging, we basically had no information available. I was able to find a binary image of the game, which ran in an emulator. But as for the platform itself, there's essentially no information. We still have not seen a user manual or programming reference manual. Oddly, we found a complete set of schematics. So we could build one, we just don't know how to program it. And so at times, once or twice, we had to dip into the emulator code to actually find out how things were supposed to happen on this machine. And so the work essentially progressed in 2 parts. So I started looking at the code and data and building some tools and doing some reconstructions. And I thought to myself, gosh, wouldn't it be awesome if I, say, had, I don't know, a student working on his master's with me who was really good, better than I am at Z80 code, who had built their own Z80 computer for fun, and whose office was on the other side of the building. And that would be Hayden.
Hi, so I'm Hayden, one of John's students, and was kind of tasked with looking into this game, seeing what we could learn from its data, is there anything interesting about it, and such. So the game is broken up into like 5 files. We have the main game executable, Vixen Deso, it has a high score file, and then 3 other files comprising basically all the game data they couldn't array cram into the main file. So the first interesting thing we can see is the high scores file called top 6, and as the name might imply, it contains the top 5 high scores. So you can see just by looking at the file, the scores stand out as these 5-character strings. They're not really hidden at all, so quite obvious the scores are there. But in between them, we find this gap of 6 characters, which also lines up with the scores being 6 characters, but they're these unprintable dots. And it actually turns out it's just a bit of minor obfuscation in there, for some reason put in by the game creator. They just add an offset of 64 to these various scores. Though you'd figure if you were going to obfuscate anything, it would be the actual score data, so that someone cheating to boast their friends isn't going to just change that and have their own little score there. Another thing with the Vixen is it does not have any graphical capabilities whatsoever. It is pure text, but it tries to make up for this by including some block drawing characters in the first 32 sections of its character set, which otherwise is pretty standard. They're fairly primitive, but they get the job done. So since we didn't have that reference manual, we actually had to go into the machine's ROM image that we got from the emulator and actually extract these out to kind of get an idea of what was actually being represented. Interestingly enough, we look at the upper half of that character set, or the bottom half as you can see here, it's actually made up of a bunch of Arabic characters, though we found no reference in marketing of this ever being marketed in Arab-speaking regions around the world. So the problem with this character set is our standard tools don't actually speak this language with those fancy block drawing characters, so when we try and dump the ROMs, we get this very bland image with a bunch of unprintable dots in there. So the solution for that was to actually create our own tools here using that ROM font that we extracted from the ROMs earlier. So we can see here we have some of the raw reconstructed game data, though even just looking at this, it's really hard to tell where things are, what they represent, just from this blob. So if we continue on here, we can actually see one of the main components here we extracted by looking through the game's data, through its code that we reverse engineered, and we could find the player ship here actually being stored in these horizontal strips, left to right, top to bottom. Though this game is anything but consistent, so we find the enemy's ships, all the other tiles on the map, they're actually being stored reverse of that, right to left, top to bottom. It's kind of interesting, all this stuff. More inconsistencies. So the claw enemy here is one of the most complicated things, this animated figure, and stored completely different than anything else, right to left, bottom to top. And it was actually one of the most difficult things to find due to its large size. It really didn't show up in these ROM dump images that we were doing. And when we finally found the code, it was this long, obtuse function that just went on and on and on, and was not very helpful at all. Oh, but there's more. So the big game data objects, such as the gas station here, are stored completely different yet again. They're stored bottom to top, left to right, and looking at that dump image on the left here, you can really see there's not much to go on. It's just this mess and maybe some structure in there, but it really doesn't help. So you really have to dig into the code to actually find stuff like this. And of course, there's one more way. The title screens and all the other menu screens are stored much the same way as that station, but they add that obfuscation for whatever reason on there of that 64 character offsets. And so besides these tile objects, we also had to do some additional simulation of the console of the Vixen, because some of these graphics were actually drawn out using the operating system's print text function. So yet another way we had to reconstruct to be able to figure out this data of the game, such as the player 1 and player 2 make ready screens here. So you have to remember the Vixen only has this 64 kilobytes of memory. It has a floppy disk drive that can only store a few hundred kilobytes on it. And that floppy disk has to hold this game, the operating system, and all the other utilities on there. So space is really limited for this game. And that can really be seen in the level data here. So level is actually broken up into these vertical strips, and they're only being stored as 6 bytes each strip. We have a little top pillar coming down from the top of the screen of some character, some number of bytes, capped off with a unique cap character to add some visual interest. Then from the bottom of the screen, much the same thing. We have a bottom pillar character repeated sometimes, capped off on a different character. So you think this would give some pretty limited levels, but actually some of the levels are fairly interesting. Like the first level here, we start off with this heavily fortified area opening up to a slightly bigger cave. We have a very narrow winding cave in the second level, and the third level is this really open plains type area with some mountains. So we've seen that we can look at the game's data and kind of extract what it was doing, but what can we learn about the development of the game through its data? So one thing that's really obvious with this game is kind of development was done one direction, never looking back, and this can really be seen in the player and the enemy jets. So on the left here, we can see the enemy jet as it actually appears in the game, this kind of interesting ship. But on the various menu screens, we see these two different representations, which kind of really indicate that they didn't look back, or maybe their tools didn't really have a way of them to reference this previous art, just kept changing over and over. Interesting, we also see aspects of development left in the code with these various hook calls being placed around calls to the operating system. And these hooks were most likely used during development to attach to a debugger so they can actually figure out what they were doing right before one of these system calls, figure out the state of the game. But it's kind of interesting that they left these in development in the final product, as these take up quite a bit of space throughout the code, and space is quite limited. So these were just changed to be nothings. They're there, but they don't do anything useful. And something really interesting to think about, was this game actually written for or even on this Osborne Vixen? So the Vixen makes use of this ZA CPU, which is kind of a superior processor to the Intel 8080. It's a strict superset of the instructions, so anything the 8080 can do, it can do, but it has some more here. But when we look through Desolation's code, through our disassembly and reverse engineering, we found none of these additional instructions throughout the program. It was just the pure 8080 instructions, and in fact we saw some workarounds that were common in 8080 code that when you move to the Z80 could be done one instruction, and these were still present in the game. So that led us to a couple theories of development here, with John believing that Desolation might have been developed on some other CPM machine running on it with an 8080 processor instead of on the Vixen, so they wouldn't, when they were testing, they wouldn't be able to make use of these sets or such. My theory here is that Desolation was developed maybe on the Vixen or another CPM machine with a Z80 processor, but it used the assembler that came with the operating system, a really common assembler, and that assembler only supports these 8080 instructions, even if you're on a processor that has additional ones, and you'd have to kind of make use of some weird tricks and hacks to get access to these instructions. So other things we see kind of indicating both these theories is there's variables being used in the code to represent constants, which are very inefficient on the processor, but it kind of leaves this impression that this was delivered to Osborne as maybe a binary and told, hey, change these 5 memory locations and you'll be good. And finally, in the name we see Vixen Deso. No other game on the disk is labeled like this, so it implies it kind of came from the author. And why would you name your program this longer name with the machine name in there if you didn't really have it on any other system? And with that, I'll hand you back to John.
So there's a bit more evidence once you start looking beyond the game, and Hayden found a video on YouTube, and what this video seems to depict is one of the demos of the Vixen running, and what it seems to have captured is a very early prototype version, because you see the spaceship flying but there's nothing shooting at it, and this is not a situation that ever occurs in the game. So this is what it might have looked like originally when the programmer was creating it. And we also found some ads. So this one was from 1984, and it indicates that besides the Vixen, there were versions available for the Osborne 1 and the Osborne Executive. And a bit later, there was a version for the K-Pro, which is another CPM machine. And this has a couple of other things of note in here, one of which was that apparently there were other level sets, and we have found none of them. They are essentially gone. The author seems to have been branching out. It might be hard to read, but it's Trifle Pursuit, which is a Trivial Pursuit knockoff by the looks. And the last 4 digits of the phone number are PDBM, which are indicative of a database program that they had started selling. Now, the big question for us was, who is the author of this? And we found a likely candidate, but we were unable to contact them. If Barry Campbell is one day watching this on YouTube, but to wrap up, especially from the archaeogaming point of view, what have we learned? Well, one thing we've been able to demonstrate here is that even when we start with very, very little information about a game or its platform, we can still reverse engineer lots of stuff and find out things about this game and its development. And in fact, there are these hints of these practices used by game programmers, just as you would expect to find tool marks in pottery. And the diversity of ways that the data was stored in the game really underscores something we found out in any number of other games, and that is the level of human ingenuity and of creativity really plays itself out in these old games. But even though we're looking at a relatively short time span, I mean, we're not talking about something in more traditional archaeological time. This is only 34 years. But even at this point, we already have questions that we have to make interpretations about. Thank you very much.